We will start just before. So welcome everyone to this CSDC activity. Just before introducing you to our guest this morning, I have a couple of announcements to make and some reminders as well. Premièrement, un certain nombre de membres du CECD de l'Université Laval préparent actuellement la première édition de l'école interdisciplinaire de méthodologie qui aura lieu à l'Université Laval à Québec au début du mois de janvier. C'est une belle occasion de formation méthodologique en méthodologie quantitative, qualitative, computationnelle en français. Et pour les étudiants et les postdoctorants du CECD, je vous rappelle qu'il y a des bourses de 500 $ pour appuyer votre inscription à cette école. Et la date limite pour faire une demande a été reportée au 20 décembre prochain. Deuxième annonce, le comité des étudiants au cycle supérieur et postdoctorants prépare une autre école de méthodologie, notre école hivernale qui a lieu depuis quelques années, un peu plus tard en janvier. Ce sera au début février cette année. C'est une école au sein de laquelle des étudiants partagent leurs compétences pour certaines techniques d'analyse. Alors, le comité est à la recherche de présentateurs, d'instructeurs qui enseigneront chacun un atelier dans le cadre de cette école. Et vous avez jusqu'au 10 décembre pour signifier votre intérêt auprès des organisateurs. Troisièmement, nous avons une nouvelle, depuis cette semaine, nous avons une nouvelle offre de financement pour les étudiants et postdoctorants pour de la traduction ou de l'édition de textes destinés à publication dans une langue autre que votre langue maternelle. So it's a new opportunity for to support translation and editing for students and postdoctoral fellows who desire to submit a paper written in a language different than their primary language. Funding is available on a continuous basis, first come, first serve. And you will find all the details on our website and our weekly newsletter. And finally, we are about to make an announcement for a CSDC holiday activity. We won't be able to organize an in-person party this year, but we will do something to celebrate the holidays in a different way. So it's a great pleasure this morning to introduce our speaker, Kaat Smets. Like some of you, I first met Kaat during her PhD as she spent a couple of months in Montreal as a visiting student at Université de Montréal. We believe that it was in 2007, but we are not sure if it was 2006 or 7. Kaat had a BA in journalism and communication, MA in politics and communication. And in 2010, she got her PhD in political and social sciences from the European University Institute in Florence. Since 2013, she is a senior lecturer in politics and quantitative methods at the Department of Politics and International Relations at Royal Holloway College at University of London. She is also the co-editor-in-chief of Electoral Studies, a journal many of you are familiar with. Political Behavior, European Journal of Political Research, Parliamentary Affairs, Acta Politica, Journal of Elections, Public Opinion and Parties are other journals which have published Kaat's works. Her research focuses on why people participate in politics. One of her most famous publications is a meta-analysis on micro-level determinants of turnout, published in 2013 in Electoral Studies. Among other things, she is particularly interested in how patterns of political participation change over time. She just published this year a chapter on this topic in the Handbook of aging in the social sciences. And there's another chapter coming in 2022 in the Oxford Handbook of Political Participation. But today she will present us fresh data, fresh findings, I believe, of a new research about the impact of local and national competitiveness on turnout in single-member plurality systems like the Canadian and the British election systems. So, Kaat, thank you very much for being with us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Frédéric. It's lovely being here. I wish I could be there in person, but it's great to see so many friendly and familiar faces. I'm very excited about this opportunity. So let me try to share my screen. Is that working? Yes, perfect. Okay, very good. Okay, so thank you for this opportunity. This is a paper I've actually been working on for a long time, but it was in my drawer for a really long time because I worked on it, then updated the data, the findings changed, I got discouraged, and then this summer decided, no, I really need to do something with it. And this presentation actually gave me the reason to update the data set further. So yes, they are all fresh findings based on the now completely updated data set. And so what is this about, this paper? I mean, very truthfully, the origin of the paper is that I had to collect this data on constituency level competitiveness. And I spent so much time on it that I thought I need to publish something with this. And so what I will be presenting today is sort of the paper that started a long time ago, but then more recently, I asked Dr. Hannah Bunting from the University of Exeter, who works a lot on competitiveness, sort of for help to make me accountable, make sure that I finish this and hopefully get it published somewhere. So it's about competitiveness, and is it local or national competitiveness that is most important in single-member plurality systems? So we know that high-stake elections attract more voters than elections that are not competitive. And that's for two reasons, two causal mechanisms. The first is related to the rational choice model, and it's that the closer the race is, the higher the probability will be that a single vote makes a difference, and therefore turnout should be higher in more competitive elections. The second causal mechanism is linked to the mobilization model, and it's that the closer the race, the higher the mobilization efforts of parties and candidates will be. Now, of course, we can't really observe competitiveness practically, but nonetheless, parties and even voters are aware when an election is deemed to be more competitive or is going to be more competitive. And so they will make more efforts when that is the case. So we know that competitiveness matters, and it does so for two reasons. But then the next question is, in countries like the UK, like Canada, where we have single-member plurality systems, you know, what plays a role? Because we know that the closeness of the race at the national level is traditionally part of voter turnout research, but especially in single-member plurality systems, you know, several people, and André is one of them, have suggested that, well, we should take into account local competitiveness as well. And so you see that this is sometimes done, but sometimes not done, and I'll say why that is the case later. But so what we are trying to do in this paper is look at two questions. The first is, which matters most for turnout? Is it the closeness of the race at the local or at the national level? And then how do we measure closeness? Because that's one of the reasons why we don't really have a clear-cut answer to the question of how does closeness matter, because there are a lot of competing measures. And so I'm trying to work out, can we find a winner amongst the different ones that we know are available? So when it comes to measuring competitiveness and the effect of competitiveness competitiveness on voter turnout, we find mixed findings in the literature. And so I've cited here a number of review articles. And so Gijs in 2006 and Cancela and Gijs, that's their updated version in 2016, they look at aggregate level turnout. And so in 2016, Cancela and Gijs, they find that 46% of the test shows a positive relationship between district closeness, so constituency closeness, and turnout, so that's aggregate turnout, compared to 70% at the national level. So basically, their national level competitiveness definitely plays a role. Local competitiveness, there is some role for it, but the relationship seems to be weaker. Stockhammer in 2012 finds, he also looks at aggregate level turnout, finds that electoral closeness is inconclusive at best. So we don't really know whether it plays a role or not. It sometimes does, sometimes doesn't. And then Caroline and I, in our meta-analysis from 2013, where we look at individual level turnout, so that's the difference, we find a success rate of around 30% for national level competitiveness. So we find that it does what we would expect it to do in 30% of the cases, but district level competitive in 0% of the cases. So we basically, in our review article, don't find any support that local competitiveness, so constituency level competitiveness, plays a role. And so the impact of competitiveness is obviously theoretically based on perceptions of the race. And it would be preferable to use ex ante measures of competitiveness, so things that we can measure before the election. But that is difficult for a number of reasons. So we obviously do have pre-election opinion and exit polls. I recently saw a paper that about a database that actually looks at this a long way back in time. So that's great, but it usually if it's available, it usually only measures competitiveness at the national level. And so of course, then you still can't measure local competitiveness. So those are two reasons why the mixed findings, I think, for two reasons. So one is, okay, so it should be measured competitiveness before or after. I think theoretically we should do before the election, but in practice we always measure it with measures from when the election has already taken place. The second reason is that there is disagreement in the literature on how we should measure competitiveness. And so I'll dive into that a little bit more. So in this paper, we're going to compare 5 measures of competitiveness. And why these 5? Because in my review of the literature, but you'll tell me later that there's something I missed. According to my review of the literature, these are sort of the 5 measures that should matter most is in single-member plurality systems. There are, of course, other measures, but they often boil down to a version of one of these things that are on this list here. So what am I going to look at? 5, as I said, operationalizations of competitiveness. So the first is the size of the electorate. And the idea is that the larger the electorate, the less competitive the election is. So that's why it's the negative sign behind size of the electorate. And so the less competitive, the lower turnout will be. But however, in the literature, the size of the electorate hardly ever has the expected negative effect on turnout. So that's something to keep in mind. And the second measure that we're looking at is majority status, which is the distance of the vote share between the first place party and 50%. So negative values indicate that the largest party did not obtain 50% of the vote. Positive values indicate that the largest parties won by a majority. And so the more positive the majority status, the larger the victory of the first place party. So that means the less competitive or the less close the election is. Then third, we look at the two-party margin. And that is the difference between the votes for the first place and the second place party divided by the total number of votes for those two parties. So low values correspond to more competition, so we expect a negative association. Margin of the victory is the fourth measure. And that's the simple difference between the first place and the second place party. And the larger the difference in the vote share between the parties, the less competitive the election is. So we again expect a negative association. And then lastly, we're going to look at the competitiveness index, because as you will see, most of these measures are based on the first two placed parties. But even in single member plurality systems, which are of course traditionally two-party systems, we often have more than two effective parties running. And so if you were doing this, well, I mean, you wouldn't be doing this research about local competitiveness in a system like the Netherlands, because it doesn't make sense. The whole country is one constituency. But even in countries with, that are traditionally two-party systems, we may need to take into account more than two parties. And so that is what the competitiveness index tries to do by Andersby and all. So it is a measure of competitiveness that takes into account the effective number of parties and the competition between the effective electoral parties competing in the race. So what we end up with is an index that ranges from 0 to 1, where higher values indicate closer elections. So basically, out of these 5 measures that we will be looking at, 4 we expect a negative association with turnout, and the final one, competitiveness index, we expect a positive association with turnout. So what we did, I see, and now I've lost the ability to move my slides forward, and I don't know why. Okay, good. So what we did for this paper, what I originally did is we pulled together all the British election studies from 1964 to 2019. And so then you have information on 16 elections. The total number of respondents is around 41,000. But what we then did is we added to that individual level data information on vote shares at the constituency level and at the national level, because for each respondent in the BES, we know what constituency they live in. And so if you add information on vote shares in the constituency at a given point in time, then you can obviously measure constituency level competitiveness, and you can do the same for each of the election years. So that was actually more work than it maybe sounds, because nowadays for the British election studies, 2010 was the first year I think Pippa Norris collected information on vote shares in all of the constituencies. And then since then, that information is also available. Before 2010, you basically had to go and collect the information by hand. And so I got the information on the vote shares of the parties at the constituency level. I know that this was literally still, we go back to finding books and then sort of for each constituency look up what the vote shares of the parties are. So that information comes from sources such as Crew and Fox 1984, Karamani 2000, Electoral Commission, and then information on the size of the electorate and aggregate constituency turnout comes from Kimmer and Outlaw. That's a different source from 2012. But so especially for the earlier elections before 2010, this was all literal sort of data collection by ourselves. So what we then end up with is we have the BES, 16 election, 40,000 respondents, and then we add vote shares at the constituency level and national level to all that information. And so we have roughly 200 to 250 constituencies per election out of the 650 that there are in the UK. That's because, of course, the British election doesn't include respondents from all 650 constituencies because they sample. So most election years, it's about 200, 250 constituencies per election, but there are exceptions. So in the very early years, there were only respondents from around 80 constituencies. 2001, 2005, the number was also lower than average. And in 2015 and 2019, it was higher than average. But in total, we've got information on roughly 3,400 constituencies. So what you basically have is 41,000 respondents nested in 3,400 constituencies over 16 elections. And I'm not saying years, but I'm talking about elections because 1974 had 2 elections in 1 year. So to start with, I just wanted to look at the pairwise correlations between all of my measures of competitiveness and both individual level and constituency level turnout. And so you see on the left-hand side are the measures of competitiveness that I talked about earlier. So the C behind it means that it's measured at the constituency level, and the N behind it means that it's measured at the national level. So a couple of things to note here is that size of the electorate doesn't have a statistically significant correlation with neither individual at the constituency level, neither individual level turnout and constituency level turnout. But other than that, most of them have the expected sign. But apart from two instances, and I don't know if I use my mouse, if you can see this, but this here, there is a positive correlation where we expected a negative one. And so sorry for both of these, we expected negative correlations, and this one is also not statistically significant. What we also see, and that's not surprising, but the correlations with constituency level turnout are generally higher than they are with individual level turnout, but that's because we're obviously doing aggregate measures with aggregate measures. So this was just in terms of exploring this a little bit. And then next, I wanted to have a look at competitiveness by election year. So what we did here is we look at 5 measures of competitiveness, and then 1 point each was assigned to elections with the highest or the more competitive quartiles, and a score of 0.25 for elections with the lowest or least competitive quartiles. And so basically this is just to look at the overtime trend, and what you see is that in 1960 and 70, so competition, the first 3 elections, competition is high. So here, and then it really goes down, and then sort of 2017 is a sort of a recent outlier in this trend of low competitiveness. And that sort of corresponds with what we know about the competitiveness of elections overall. But this is just to sort of as a check to make sure that sort of the information that we get out of these measures roughly makes sense. Okay, so in terms of the actual models that I'm going to look at, so I'm trying to look at competitiveness, constituency level and national level competitiveness, and which of the 2 matters, or do they both measure, and can we declare a winner amongst different measures of competitiveness. And so the empirical strategy is basically that by regression models, because there isn't sort of a clear-cut way, I think, to model this. So we started with simple logistic regression with robust standard errors by election. But then because, of course, these data are nested, we then looked at multi-level regression with random election effects. So it's sort of looking, there's some overtime element, but the problem here is, of course, these constituencies, they aren't the same from one year to the next because constituency boundaries change. So the question is, can we treat this sort of as a time series data in this respect or not? So if you say not, then you should follow the logic of number 2 here. If you say that it can, then you should follow the logic of step number 3 here. So the first 3 models are all with individual level turnout as the dependent variable. And then lastly, because we had it anyway, we also wanted to see whether local and national competitiveness mattered for constituency level turnout. And so the only caveat here is that we don't look at all constituencies, but we only look at those constituencies that were included in the British election study. So it's the 3,500, 3,400 that I talked about earlier. So in most of the models that you will see, we include a number of control variables, but I'm not reporting these, and I've basically also summarized the findings sort of in a slightly dummy-ish way, because I personally know if there's lots of numbers on my screen, I don't find that the easiest way to follow a presentation on a screen. But so the models where I indicate that control variables are included, and those are the individual level models, I looked at my own work, Smets and the meta-analysis, and looked at, okay, which variables are consistently linked to individual level turnout, and then which ones of those are included consistently in the British election studies. And so then we were able to include age squared, gender, whether someone, what their level of education is, whether they work or not, as a sort of a proxy for social class, and then whether they voted in the previous election or not. And of course, we could have theoretically included a lot more, but then you start missing certain variables in certain years. And so these were included in all years minus one, which I now can't remember, but it was only available in 5/6 of the sample. Okay, so looking at the first model, so this is the one where we look at individual level turnout, so whether someone said they voted in the election or not. These are basic logistic regression models with standard errors clustered by election. And so the control variables that I just discussed are included in all of these models. They do more or less what we expect them to do, except gender, which is not statistically significant, but that's also not really surprising. So I left those out because that's not what we're here to do. So in each of these models, I include a different measure of competitiveness, measured both at the constituency level, which is the C, and measured at the national level, which is the N. I obviously can't include all of these measures at the same time because they're all measuring the same thing. So they need to go into separate models. And so I think the main message here is, first of all, we see that a lot of the times the national measures of competitiveness are not significant. So that's for two-party margin, margin of the victory, competitiveness index. For the size of electorate, we were expecting a negative association. We see that one is positive, the constituency level version, and the national level version isn't. Here, this is also slightly odd because this should be, we are expecting a negative association, which it is at the constituency level, but not the majority stage at the national level. So, but the question is, of course, is this the right way to model this? Because as I said, it's actually we have individuals nested in constituencies, nested in election years. So if we're assuming that we cannot compare the constituencies over time because of boundary changes, then you include random effects for election only. And so these are multi-level logistic regression models. Same idea, the control variables are all included. They again do more or less what we expect them to do, except gender. And so what you see in this model is that actually these national level measures of competitiveness now mostly do reach statistical significance, except the last one, the Competitiveness Index. But we can again see sort of differences in the direction of the coefficient between the constituency level and the national level measures. So we were in this instance expecting both to be negative. In this instance, too, for majority status, we were also expecting them both to be negative. And so, yeah, again, is this the right way to model this, or should we assume that actually, constituencies can be compared over time? There's obviously a correlation between one constituency, between different elections. So should we be taking this into account? So if you then do the multi-level model, but with random effects of the election and constituency level, this is what you get. So again, these national level measures tend to not be significant. So that's true for 4 cases here. And then the size of electorate continues to have that mixed effect. So positive for constituency and negative for national level size of the electorate. Then the majority status, two-party margin and margin of the victory, and the competitiveness at the constituency level, those effects are all this expected direction. Now I'll say something more on this in a second. But the final model that I wanted to show is this one, and that is where we switch from individual level turnout to constituency level turnout. And so what was turnout in a given constituency in a given election year? because I was just interested to see what these measures do in that situation. And then you see that all of them, constituency level and national competitiveness, are all statistically significant, although not all. In the case of the size of the electorate and the majority status, again, we see sort of these flipped signs, whereas they should theoretically be the same. So, I mean, I guess part of the problem here is sort of how we've got different levels of variation at the constituency level and the national level. So at the national level, we've got only 16 observations, and at the constituency level, we've got, 3,400 observations. And that must, I think that's the reason behind why the findings is slightly different between the different models. But I'd love to have your thoughts later on, model specification and if there are other things that we should be doing. So my second question was, okay, so out of these different measures, these 5 measures of competitiveness, is there one that, clearly outperforms the rest? And this slide is basically to tell you not really. So first of all, adding competitiveness to the models compared to a model with control variables only, so individual level control variables only. If you then add competitiveness, not much happens, is the first message. And then also when you compare sort of measures of model fit, and I focused here on log likelihood and pseudo R-square, but if you use the BIC, AIC, it's the same story. If you compare between the different measures of competitiveness, in terms of model fit, they all, it's all more or less at the same level. And so basically, I find it impossible to say, okay, there's clearly one measure of competitiveness here that outperforms all the rest in terms of model fit. So what is the morale of this story? So it does seem that alongside national level competitiveness, there is a clear case for including constituency level competitiveness as well, when you're trying to look at turnout in single member plurality systems, because we've seen that these constituency level measures of competitiveness do have a statistically significant effect on voter turnout at the individual and the constituency level. So I think that's the case to be made based on this information. And like I said, the recent versions of the British election studies, and this may be true for Canadian election studies as well, this information is now publicly available. So it's actually really easy to include this nowadays. But then, as I also said, so while I think, we have a case for including constituency level competitiveness, I find it impossible to declare a winner among the various operationalizations that we looked at. So in terms of the next steps, and I'm now going to be very honest with you. So what this, I think what this paper, I think does, because it is a paper, does what it sets out to do quite well. But it's, the findings aren't super clear cut, especially because, the signs of the coefficients keep changing. And so there's 2 things I wonder. So one is model specifications. Are there things that we are completely overlooking that we should really be looking at? But also, I wonder if, what matters most, closeness of the race at the constituency level, closeness of the race at the aggregate level. I'm editor of electoral studies, and I probably think that, okay, if I saw this paper, I would be thinking, okay, yes, nice, but what's nice paper, but what's the theoretical contribution? So I do also wonder if we need to do something to go above and beyond that. And so one of the things that I was thinking on is whether it would be possible to focus on the causal mechanisms. And so the 2 causal mechanisms were that competitiveness in votes in competitive elections count more and that parties will mobilize voters. Now, that mobilization aspect is maybe something that one could measure, but I sort of haven't really thought through what that means in terms of the data. So am I then saying that as a voter, you would be observing competitiveness at the constituency level mostly, or is it the national level? So yeah, these are not really fully formed ideas, as you can hear, but I'd love to have your thoughts on both these things or on anything else that you would like to comment on. So thank you very much for listening.
And thank you very much for that presentation, Kat. We will move to the Q&A, but if you don't mind, I'm going to start with 2 questions and a general.
Yeah. I'll stop sharing because.
Yes, a general observation to start with.
Yeah.
Because I understand that some of your models detect an impact of competitiveness, other do not, but generally speaking, I understand from your findings that there's a good amount of evidence that competitiveness matters to explain voting turnout. And so I assume that from a communication point of view, it's a good strategy for party candidates for local candidates to disseminate the perception that the race is very close in the district in order to mobilize the voters. But I have 2 questions. The first one is, so far you analyze the impact of national and local competitiveness separately. What about the possibility of an interaction? And regarding the causal mechanism, I will hypothesize that I will make the hypothesis that I'm more likely to vote, to cast a ballot, if my perception is that the race at the national level is close and the race in my district is also close, and so that my district may have an impact on the national outcome, maybe. So that is the first question. Is there something, maybe not in your analysis, but in the literature about that? And the second thing, because you have extensively studied the relation between age and political participation, would it be possible to make some hypotheses regarding is competitiveness more likely to have an impact on younger or older voters? Can we have an interaction there or not really?
Yes, thank you. Would you like me to respond now or take more questions?
Yes, please respond now.
Yes, thank you very much, Felix. I think that actually this idea of suggesting a strategy to parties is a nice way to end the paper. So thanks for giving me that idea. By the interaction between local and national competitiveness. So no, I haven't thought of this myself. I haven't done it. I can't remember seeing it before, but I do see the logic of what you're saying is that, if competitiveness in both is high, that should have even more of an impact. So I think it's definitely worth exploring, but also looking, I haven't been looking for this, but I can look a bit better and see if anyone has already done this or suggested this. About the age and participation, actually in a previous version of the paper, I did look at age and I can't remember what the findings were, exactly with the idea that because of the impressionable years, young people should be more, they are more susceptible to influences, and competitiveness may be one of those. So maybe that's something to go back to sort of add another layer or add another dimension to this paper. So thank you for reminding me that I did look at this once and that I should maybe go back to it. Thank you.
Thank you. Ruth.
Yeah, thanks, Kaat, for a great talk. Really interesting. I have a few thoughts that I'll just share with you. The first one is that I guess in terms of focusing on significance, a lot depends on sort of what should the standard errors be. And with 16 elections, I think especially for the national level, that's sort of hard to tell, and the clustering might just be too severe, and then we might too easily conclude that there's nothing there. Well, actually there is, we just don't have enough cases. So I think a first comment would be that I guess overall you find quite some evidence that competitiveness matters, which contrasts with the meta-analysis results that you summarized at the beginning. So maybe you could just sell that more and then focus on substantive effects a bit more. That might be one way to sort of give a spin to the paper and to sell the importance of the findings a bit more. A second point relates to the British case, and focusing on that specific case, where one concern I would have is the huge heterogeneity in terms of what parties win in which parts of the United Kingdom, especially if we're focusing on indicators that focus on the two main parties. It really matters if we're focusing on England or Scotland or Wales, and if we're just focusing on the two main parties overall, then we're not necessarily using the best measure of the real competitiveness in Scotland, for example. So one conclusion from that could be that, well, maybe we need yet another competitiveness indicator that is specific to the regional structure of competition in the UK, and that would be a third type of competitiveness measure, I guess. Or alternatively, it means that maybe the UK is not the best case to be able to identify whether it's the national or the constituency level that matters most. I guess that is not the conclusion you want to take after having, or you want to end with after having done all this work. And then the final thought is just given that you indicated that you're looking for ways to sort of expand this or potentially, I was thinking it would be really great if you can do a bit more with the individual level, maybe come up with some theorizing about what factors moderate these effects, and especially what would be really cool is if you would have an idea about which voters are most affected by the constituency versus the national level, and I would presume that could be related to how politically interested or politically informed people are, and people who really follow politics closely should be more aware of what is going on in their own constituency potentially, and sort of be more influenced by that. So that might be one avenue. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ruud. Yeah, you are hitting the nail on the head about this. You had the idea that at the national level we only have 16 observations, and I think really that definitely plays a role here. So yes, focusing on substantive effect sizes, that makes a lot of sense. Actually, you know, we do have them somewhere, but they just weren't part of this presentation. But I do see how, you know, that can tell more of the story that's maybe hidden at the moment. You also got a fair point about the differences in regions. And when we said that, I thought, you know what, I haven't even made a case for why we should look at this in the UK. And the answer is basically, I didn't have a reason. It's just I already had the data. And so that's why. So I have to come up with a good theoretical reason why we actually should study this in the UK. But you've got a good point about the regions. And that's one of the things that we had considered or is on our to-do list, is to definitely also look whether the results differ per region, because they are slightly different systems and slightly different levels of competitiveness. So it's something that we're definitely going to explore more, and we'll see what comes out of it. If it does, you know, if there aren't really any differences, then at least we can say that we checked that. And yes, you are right about these, you know, trying to do more with these the individual level analysis. And I thank you very much for your suggestions. I just need to, you know, go back and have a little think about sort of what could moderating variables be. Do I have those? Because that's also part of the problem. Of course, I will have some of them, but not for all election years, and then that is a problem. But I need to put more thought in that. So I'm going to add that to the list of Frederic, which the HM participation, but you know, and I have a little bit of more of a think about that, because I think that would take the paper to the next level if I was able to look at this more. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I was asking my question when Ben, Andre, and Henry raised their hands. So I apologize, guys. I didn't notice who has raised his hand first. So I will go with Ben, then Henry and Andre. Ben?
Oh, thank you, Fred. I thought you were going to say you were going to go in like reverse order of handsomeness, but in which case I would still be first. Anyway, thank you very much, Kaat. It was a really interesting presentation. I'm going to sort of ask almost the opposite question of Ruth. I'm a geographer, so I'm actually sort of what caught my attention most was the constituency level analyses. So two questions, and one is just a clarification from the question Ruth asked. Your competitiveness measures don't depend on the particular parties, right? That it's that if the first and second party is conservative in labor in one constituency and SMP in labor in another, that's the same. So it's not. It's the
label of the party is taken out of the equation. Yeah.
Okay. That, and then my actual question. And I apologize if you covered this. I was having some technical problems and I was underneath my desk for a few minutes. You have control variables for the individual respondents, but I didn't see any control variables for constituencies. You had one for constituency size, I think.
No, it's actually the size of the electorate is actually one of the measures of competitiveness. But
okay.
You are right, by the way, they aren't included. And ideally, of course, they should be. So the problem with that is you can find out things like, age compositions of different constituencies, but they are linked to, the name, now I forget what it's called, the census, sorry. The census only happens every 10 years. So then for blocks of 10 years, that information just doesn't change for a constituency. And so that was my problem there, is that, of course, ideally in these constituency level models, so with aggregate constituency level, turnout is a dependent variable. I should be controlling for other factors that influence turnout. But I don't really see how I can do that if they only change every 10 years.
Okay, well, I'm also thinking of this, I'm thinking about this a lot in the American case, not even so much in the Canadian case, where, compositional effects like, the economic, sort of the average economic composition status, the kind of the racial composition have huge effects on turnout.
Yeah.
So, and then actually kind of follow on, the other thing you'd expect to affect competition, of course, is party activity, campaign expenditures. Yeah. And I deeply sympathize with the difficulty of trying to reconstruct that, historically.
Yeah.
But if there's some measure, some way, even for some of the more recent elections, of putting in measures of how much parties or candidates were putting into this.
Yes. Sure.
And then just finally coming with the census. Yeah, I mean, there are 10-year gaps, but there are ways of interpolating between census.
Okay.
That might be worth trying.
Fair enough. No, that's fair enough, and it would definitely improve those models a lot. I also like the idea of looking at this expenditure. You are right that probably for more recent elections, it should be possible to get your hands on that information. So thanks for pushing me on that. I will go back to have a look at that. Thank you.
Henry Milner.
Hello, is it my turn or?
Yes.
Can you hear me, Kaat?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Thanks. Good to see you after all this time.
You.
Even if it's not exactly the way one would like it. I've been having some trouble in and out with the internet. I may have missed a little bit and we might have some interference, but I want to get a little more about the way you use size. At the national level, I don't understand why you think size is a factor. Why would size be a factor at the national level?
Well, I mean, theoretically, I would say that if my vote is 1 out of 16 million versus 1 out of 16 million, that should, you know, theoretically make a difference. I do appreciate that, you know, the differences over time between the elections are fairly small, of course, and also incremental. So yeah, that's a fair point.
Yeah, okay. So then in terms of the constituency level now, what you find is unexpectedly, right, that the constituency that are larger overall have a higher turnout, which is interesting. Now, what do you know about what, I don't know enough about British methods for determining the size of constituencies, but, and each country is different. In the every census, they end up being identical in terms of population, but then they can play around with boundaries immensely. In Canada, we have something like a 25% margin, which is sometimes not even respected. And I assume that it's related, therefore I don't know, but isn't it related to urban-rural to a large extent? And isn't that really what you're measuring, or am I missing something?
Well, Henry, thanks for that. You're actually raising a really good point, and where I then failed to answer you because I'm not from the UK. So I you know, I'm just studying a country that I don't belong to. So my answer to your question is I do not know, but I do know who I can ask, and I will go and check that this is not just rural versus urban. So what you're basically saying, and that's a fair point, is that, you know, what does this size of the electorate at the constituency level really mean? And is this roughly even, you know, is this roughly even or completely different between different parts of the country? And the answer is it probably is. So so thank you for that point.
I do really think you should investigate that. I don't, again, yeah. It may turn out to be a dead end, but I'd be surprised.
Okay, very good. It's noted. Thank you for that.
André?
Thanks a lot. Hi, Kat. This is good to see someone working on something extremely interesting and important. Here are my initial sort of suggestions.
Yes.
Or reactions. I like the title a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Which one matters the most? And my suggestion is to have a short research note about the answer to that question, and not to do all these other things that other people are suggesting you should do.
Okay.
So that's my first suggestion.
Yeah.
I would wish to emphasize that, like Ruud, I think you should focus on the coefficients, because it's the coefficient that gives you how much impact it has. And so that's my second suggestion. I will not suggest that you do all kinds of interaction effects, but I would want to know about non-linear effects.
Yes.
Because it might be not make a difference initially and then makes a big difference.
Yep.
And finally, I would dispute the fact that all of these are measures of competitiveness. First two are not. Size is not competitiveness. It might be a factor that affects competitiveness, but I don't think it's a measure of competitiveness. Majority is not a measure of competitiveness, as well as something that might be some correlated and so on, but it is not. And even the third one, I'm not absolutely sure. The fifth one, I mean, the fifth one is it the number of parties? If it's the number of effective number of parties,
yeah,
it's the effective number of parties. It's not competitiveness at all. At least the way I conceive competitiveness. So I would not have many measures. I would have only a couple of measures. I would just try to see the coefficients in different kinds of models. And I would control for generational dummies.
Yes.
On top.
Okay.
And not doing anything else.
Thank you very much for those suggestions. So this is one thing I've learned from you is, if you can do it simple, then go for simple. And so I actually really appreciate that, so in essence, that's what you're saying, like bring it back to the basics and what it's really about. And this is the idea of a research note is one that crossed my mind, because I think in a way, well, I mean, then it does what it says on the tin, right? And I can see the advantage of that, also in terms of getting it published. So I'm taking all of your comments on board. I've written them all down. Thank you very much.
But I will say that some Andre's comments were rude regarding his colleagues.
No, he just has a difference of opinion.
Next is Liren R-Score.
Yes, hi. I'm sorry that I cannot open my camera here. I took a break from a Hanukkah celebration, so I'm sorry for that. But it's really
joining.
Yeah, I enjoyed your talk, and it's really nice seeing you all. So, well, it's a shame to ask that after Andre's comment that really closes the door for any suggestions. But I was thinking about competitiveness as a character of a constituency. So some constituencies are characterized by higher competitiveness because of the composition of the population. And so I was wondering if you can look at the average competitiveness of a constituency over different election years, and if there is, especially if there are cases of divergence. So at certain elections, the competitiveness is higher. I'm not so sure about the mechanism here. I try to think if voters are supposed to be aware of that and they are supposed to participate more, or maybe they just miss that, because I don't know if voters are aware of the competitiveness every elections, or they just know that they reside in a very competitive constituency. And so if they're aware of that. So I'm not so sure about the mechanism that I can suggest here, but maybe looking at something relates to the average of a constituency other than just controlling for the constituency level.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Liren. I think what you're getting at is this idea of some seats are safe. So the one that I live in London is a safe seat, and everyone knows it's a safe seat. It always goes to Labour, and so I mean, our voters are aware. Well, I guess that depends on the voters, but I think people would be aware if they live in a safe seat. If they live in a seat that is more competitive, I think the media would report on this. But your idea of competitiveness and how it changes over time, that's certainly also within a constituency, that's certainly also an interesting angle. So I've written it down, but I obviously need to think about all of your comments and see, how I can address them really. So, but thank you very much.
Sure.
Before handing this activity, I want to ask if there's any additional comment or question, maybe especially from students. Don't be shy to raise your hand. No, I don't think so. So it is noon. Kaat, we have a tradition at the CSDC to give a personalized gift to our speakers, and that is a tradition that we continue despite the mediation of our activities by Zoom. So usually we will ask you to open a box in front of the audience to find what the gift is about.
Yeah.
But I will ask our coordinator, Vim, to show and to describe you what the gift is.
I think that's very kind.
Well, I'm not sure if I need to describe it. It's quite self-evident. It's a cup with your poster. I will email you to ask for the address where to send it.
Oh, that is an excellent gift. Thank you very much. That's really, really great. I love having that. Thank you.
So thank you, Kaat, for your presentation, and I also acknowledge the audience for your attendance and participation today. So stay tuned for our next activities, and I wish everyone a very good day, a good weekend.
Yes, thank you for being here, and thank you for having me, and thank you for all your very helpful comments.
Great to see you, Kaat. Great to see everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Salut Thierry.
À bientôt.